Picture this. It's a cold February morning in 1967, right in the heart of 1960s Canada. You're walking down a quiet street where frost clings to every window pane. The smell of wood smoke drifts from chimneys, mixing with the crisp bite of winter air that makes your breath visible in small puffs. From inside the houses, you can hear the familiar crackle of radio broadcasts and the gentle hum of morning routines beginning. This is the Canada that millions of people still carry in their hearts today. A place that feels both distant and surprisingly close, where the rhythms of daily life created memories that would echo through generations. If you lived in Canada during those post-war decades, especially through the 1950s and 1960s, you experienced something that seems almost impossible to recreate today. You knew your neighbors, not just their names, but the sound of their screen doors closing, which kids belonged to which family, and whether Mrs. Patterson preferred her tea with one sugar cube or two. In many neighborhoods, kids called every adult uncle or aunt in front of their names because that's how close it all felt. Fences between properties were deliberately low, maybe 3 feet high, designed so people could chat while hanging laundry on the line or tending to gardens that had quietly evolved from wartime victory plots into backyard sanctuaries. The morning ritual often began before most families stirred. Glass milk bottles would appear on doorsteps like clockwork, delivered by milkmen who knew their routes by heart and their customers by name. Sometimes, mothers would leave notes tucked under the empty bottles, asking for an extra pint of cream or a dozen brown eggs, along with the exact change counted out carefully. The milkman would read these notes, fulfill the requests, and leave the proper change without question. No security cameras monitored these transactions. No tracking systems verified deliveries. It was simply one person trusting another to be honest and fair. In some neighborhoods, a breadman or a bread truck would also come by, dropping off fresh loaves and pastries. Trust wasn't just a nice idea, it was a daily habit. Inside those homes, kitchens buzzed with activity that followed patterns as reliable as sunrise. Coffee percolated in electric pots that gurgled and sighed, filling rooms with aromas that mixed with bacon, sizzling in cast iron pans, and toast browning under watchful eyes. Mothers wore house dresses and aprons, their hands already busy preparing lunches that would be carried in brown paper bags or metal lunch boxes. Fathers adjusted thin ties and checked their watches, getting ready for jobs that, for many families, paid enough to support a household on a single income. The numbers tell a story that still shocks people today. In 1960, the average house in Toronto cost around $15,000, while the typical salary hovered near $4,000 annually. Young couples could realistically save for a down payment within a few years, securing mortgages that consumed reasonable portions of their monthly earnings rather than swallowing entire paychecks. Factory workers, bank clerks, teachers, and countless other ordinary jobs provided pathways to middle-class security that felt almost guaranteed for those willing to work steadily and save wisely. Many people still remember buying a brand new bungalow for under $20,000 and paying it off on one income while raising 3, 4, or even 6 children. Children in these households lived with freedoms that would seem reckless by contemporary standards. In many families, parents would send kids outside after breakfast with one simple instruction: come home when the streetlights flickered on. No cell phones existed to provide constant contact, no GPS tracking monitored their movements, no organized activities filled every spare moment. Instead, children created their own entertainment with whatever materials they could find or imagine. Comic books, penny candy, bikes, nature walks, errands for seniors, visiting grandparents for tea and cinnamon buns. These were the screens of that era. Summer days stretched endlessly, filled with adventures that began with bike rides to wherever curiosity led. Kids built elaborate forts in nearby woods using fallen branches and discarded materials, their architectural ambitions limited only by imagination and available supplies. Road hockey games erupted spontaneously on quiet streets with makeshift nets and goalposts improvised from whatever was at hand, and games continuing until someone's mother called them home for dinner. Not every child had complete freedom. Some remember being kept inside the yard until the early 1970s, but the idea that kids belonged outdoors with other kids was almost universal. Winter brought different but equally liberating possibilities. Sleds appeared from basement storage, and hills throughout Canadian towns became gathering places where children spent entire Saturdays climbing up and racing down snowy slopes until their clothes were soaked through and their faces burned red from cold wind. Outdoor rinks flooded by volunteers turned into community magnets. Parents understood that kids might fall, might get bruises, might come home exhausted and dirty. These weren't failures of supervision, but essential parts of childhood, opportunities to learn resilience, risk assessment, and problem solving in ways no adult could script. For many who were there, those winters weren't just cold, they were magic. The landscape of Canadian identity was shifting dramatically during these decades, creating moments that still resonate in the national consciousness. February 15, 1965 marked a pivotal transformation when Canada officially adopted the maple leaf flag, replacing the red ensign with its British colonial symbols. This wasn't merely a design change, but a declaration of independence, Canada announcing to the world that it had developed its own identity, separate from Britain and distinct from American influence. The flag debate had divided the country passionately. Some Canadians embraced the modern design enthusiastically, seeing it as long overdue recognition of Canadian autonomy. Others felt deep loyalty to traditional British symbols, viewing the change as abandonment of historical connections that had shaped the nation. Yet, when that red and white flag with its distinctive 11-pointed maple leaf was raised for the first time on Parliament Hill, something shifted in how Canadians saw themselves and their place in the world. Many who were children then still remember the first time they saw it flying over their school and felt quietly proud. This spirit of building distinctly Canadian institutions extended into healthcare, where a revolution was quietly transforming how families thought about medical care and financial security. Saskatchewan had pioneered universal healthcare in 1962, despite fierce resistance from medical professionals who feared government interference in their practices. By the decade's end, the Medical Care Act of 1966 established the framework for what would become the healthcare system Canadians rely on today. Before universal healthcare, serious illness or injury could bankrupt families almost overnight. Hospital bills could force people to sell their homes or descend into debt that lasted for years. The introduction of publicly funded healthcare meant that Canadians could see doctors or visit hospitals without calculating the financial consequences first. It changed kitchen table conversations from "Can we afford this?" to "Which hospital should we go to?" and established healthcare as a right rather than a privilege reserved for those with adequate finances. The economic prosperity of these decades created opportunities that now sound almost like stories from another planet. Jobs were plentiful and often available without long, complicated application processes. Young people could walk into factories, offices, or retail establishments and sometimes begin working within days. Some remember walking into 3 factories in a single day in the late 1950s, filling out 3 applications and getting 3 job offers within 24 hours without a high school diploma. Apprenticeships provided pathways to skilled trades for those who preferred hands-on work, while universities expanded their programs and kept tuition costs remarkably affordable. A summer job could genuinely pay for most of a year of university education. Students graduated with manageable or no debt, viewing education as an investment in their futures rather than a financial gamble that might trap them for decades. The anxiety that characterizes so much of modern working life, the constant worry about job security, the need for multiple income streams, the seeming impossibility of affording homes, certainly existed in some situations, but it didn't dominate daily life for most working Canadians during these prosperous decades. Canadian culture was finding its voice during these years, producing artists who captured something essential about the national experience and shared it with the world. The Guess Who from Winnipeg became international rock stars with songs that dominated radio stations across North America. Gordon Lightfoot crafted folk melodies that became part of the country's emotional DNA, his lyrics painting pictures of landscapes and experiences that resonated deeply with listeners. Leonard Cohen released his first album in 1967, bringing poetic, introspective songs to audiences hungry for authenticity. Joni Mitchell was rising from Toronto folk clubs toward international stardom, showing that a Canadian songwriter could change what popular music sounded like. These weren't simply entertainers, but cultural ambassadors who demonstrated that Canadian stories were worth telling, and that Canadian perspectives added something unique to global conversations. For many children and teenagers of the time, their voices became the soundtrack of bus rides, record shops, basement parties, and quiet evenings with a transistor radio pressed to one ear. Television brought families together in ways that seem almost foreign now. The CBC served as the primary connection most Canadians had to national news and entertainment, creating shared experiences that united the country despite its vast distances. Hockey night in Canada represented perhaps the ultimate expression of this collective viewing. Saturday nights when entire neighborhoods would fall quiet as families gathered around television sets to watch the game. Some people still remember the way their whole street seemed to hold its breath during a breakaway, or how everyone talked about the same goal at school or work on Monday morning. Between periods, families would discuss strategy, debate referee decisions, and prepare snacks before settling back for the next 20 minutes of play. Kids lay on shag carpet or squeezed onto couches, learning the names of players long before they learned the names of politicians. For many, those nights felt like the heartbeat of the country. Canadian television programming also reflected the country's growing confidence in its own stories. Shows like The Forest Rangers and Razzle Dazzle entertained kids with adventures set in recognizably Canadian locations, featuring Canadian actors speaking with familiar accents. In an era when most television content came from the United States, seeing your own country and culture represented on screen mattered. It quietly reinforced that Canadian experiences were real, valuable, and worth putting on camera. Shopping during these decades involved deliberate social experiences that turned errands into community rituals. No online ordering systems eliminated the need for human contact, and there were no smartphone apps bringing groceries to your door within hours. You went to the butcher for meat, developing relationships with people who knew your preferences and could recommend the best cuts for Sunday dinners. The baker provided fresh bread and pastries, sometimes delivered right to your steps by a breadman who knew your family. Grocers offered produce and canned goods, along with advice about what was in season and how to prepare it. Department stores like Eaton's, Simpson's, and in the West, Woodward's, functioned as major destinations where families might spend entire Saturday afternoons. Children remember riding escalators up to toy departments, stopping at lunch counters for 25-cent French fries and 5-cent extra gravy, or a milkshake that felt like pure luxury. These outings weren't rushed. They were small events, chances to see people from your community, to be recognized, to feel part of something. Downtown areas pulsed with life. Main streets in towns and cities were lined with locally owned businesses, movie theaters, restaurants, and specialty shops that reflected the character of their communities. People dressed up to go downtown, treating the experience almost like going to a special occasion. Neon signs glowed over sidewalks crowded with pedestrians. Record shops like Sam the Record Man became pilgrimage sites for teenagers, places where you could listen to a vinyl record before deciding whether to buy it. For many, downtown Toronto, Montreal, Winnipeg, or Vancouver in the 1960s and 70s still lives in memory as the place where possibility itself seemed to gather. Transportation patterns shape how people experience their communities in simple but profound ways. Many families in the early part of this era didn't own automobiles, or they owned a single vehicle that the father drove to work, leaving mothers and children to navigate their days on foot, by bike, or using public transit. Kids routinely walked to school, even at 5 years old, often in bitter winter weather, without parents viewing it as extraordinary. Walking was simply how people moved through their communities. It created deeper connections to neighborhoods, greater awareness of seasonal changes and small details, and constant opportunities to encounter friends and neighbors along the way. Some remember boring Sundays when stores were closed by 6 o'clock or not open at all, streets quiet, families at home together whether they liked it or not. Those routines too became part of the texture of memory. By the end of the 1960s and into the 1970s, car ownership became more common, and this gradually transformed both the literal and emotional landscape. Suburbs expanded as families could live farther from where they worked. Drive-in movie theaters grew popular as date spots and family outings. Highways linked provinces in new ways, turning cross-country journeys into real possibilities instead of distant dreams. Cars represented freedom and possibility. The ability to visit relatives in another province, drive to Expo 67 in Montreal, or explore cottage country on weekends. Trust and safety characterized these decades in ways that many older Canadians still struggle to explain to younger generations. People often left their doors unlocked during the day, and some didn't bother securing them at night. Children roam freely through neighborhoods without parents constantly worrying about abduction or violence. You could leave your bike outside a corner store and expect to find it waiting when you came out. At the grocery store, regular customers could sometimes cash a paycheck without showing identification because people knew each other and reputations mattered. This wasn't because crime or hardship didn't exist, they did. But the general level of social trust that people extended to neighbors and strangers was different. There was less fear and suspicion, and a stronger assumption that most people were trying to do the right thing. When something did go wrong, it felt like a violation of the norm rather than a confirmation of everyone's worst expectations. Education during these decades reflected priorities that feel very distant now. Classrooms could be large. Some remember 35 or more children in a room, but teachers typically had more authority and less bureaucracy. Discipline was stricter, expectations were clearer, and parents were more likely to back teachers than to challenge them. Many schools had nurses on staff, and some even had dentists visiting regularly, checking children's teeth in small offices just off the main hallway. The message was simple: education mattered, and the community was willing to invest in it. Post-secondary education was becoming more accessible as universities expanded their programs while keeping tuition at levels that made higher education genuinely possible for ordinary families. A strong summer job could cover much of a year's tuition and living expenses. Students graduated with a sense that they were stepping into a world full of opportunity rather than a world already closed off. Of course, these decades weren't perfect or universally gentle. Women faced significant barriers in workplaces and public life, with careers often limited by expectations that they would stay home to raise children. Indigenous peoples continue to suffer under the legacy of residential schools and government policies designed to erase their languages and cultures. Immigration policies restricted who could come to Canada in ways that would be considered unfair today. Racial discrimination existed both in law and in practice, and many stories from that time are painful, not sweet. Looking back honestly doesn't mean pretending those problems didn't exist. It means recognizing that even with serious injustice and inequality still present, there were aspects of everyday life that worked well for many families and helped create the strong sense of community that people now miss so deeply. It means holding two truths at once: that life felt safer, more hopeful, more connected for many people, and that others were excluded from that safety and opportunity. What emerges again and again when you listen to people who lived through these years is a quiet, steady optimism. They remember believing almost without question that tomorrow would be better than today. They remember thinking that if you worked hard and lived decently, you'd be able to buy a house, raise a family, pay for your children's education, and one day retire without fear. Many still describe those decades as the best years of their lives, not because everything was easy, but because life felt understandable, manageable, and full of possibility. This was the Canada of those transformative decades, a place where community connections often mattered more than individual advancement, where neighbors brought meals when someone was sick, where block parties and basement gatherings lasted late into summer nights, a place where kids could disappear on their bikes all day, running errands for seniors, visiting grandparents, or just wandering until dinner time. A place where Halloween meant homemade popcorn bowls, candied apples, and old ladies inviting children in for a slice of pie. And where Christmas meant streets full of lights and churches full of choirs. It wasn't perfect, but it was different in ways that shaped an entire generation's understanding of what community and country could be when they worked reasonably well. The neighborhoods, the daily rituals, the way people treated each other. These weren't just pleasant extras that made life nicer. They were the framework that held everything together. Looking back at these decades isn't about trying to turn the clock back or denying the progress that's been made since then. It's about asking what we might learn from a time when one income could support a family, when homes were places to live rather than investments, when children knew every house on their street, and when coffee with neighbors happened in living rooms more often than in crowded cafes. It's about remembering that a country isn't just policy and politics, but also the everyday gestures of trust and kindness that make ordinary life feel safe and meaningful. The smells of percolating coffee and wood smoke, the sounds of screen doors and neighborhood kids playing until dark, the feel of wool mittens and paper maps, the sight of a milk bottle waiting on the step. These sensory details remind us that home isn't just a physical place. It's a feeling of belonging, of being known, of knowing where you fit in the world. If this time still lives somewhere inside you, maybe in the memory of a school nurse, a downtown record shop, a corner store that cashed your paycheck, or a long summer day on your bike, those memories are part of Canada's story too. If you'd like to, share one small thing you remember from those years. Someone else may read it and realize they weren't alone. And if this walk through Canada's golden decades brought you back even for a moment, there's always another chapter of yesterday waiting in the next story.